Good morning, everyone from Santa Monica, California. Good afternoon or good evening to those of you joining us from elsewhere in the world. My name is Aaron Malas. I'm an associate director in the Center for Regional Economics at the Milken Institute. I'm very pleased to be joining you today for our event on the future of work in cities, with a particular focus on high-tech growth as a cornerstone for recovery and opportunity. We have a extremely distinguished panel joining us this morning with representatives from the Milken Institute, Amazon Web Services, the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and the University of Pennsylvania. We're really excited for today's conversation. We're going to start out with a brief discussion of the Milken Institute's Best Performing Cities report and some of the insights from that, and then segue into a broader discussion of how some of the insights regarding high-tech growth and opportunity in the United States might have implications or might provide some lessons for cities and their growth elsewhere in the world. So to begin with, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Misael Galdames, from our team at the Center for Regional Economics to discuss the Best Performing Cities report. We'll follow up introducing the rest of the panelists. Misael, thank you for joining us. Could you talk to us a little bit about the key insights from BPC 2021, and in particular, some of the changes that were made to the index this year and what that meant for how metro areas ranked?
Yeah, sure. Just good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me, Aaron. It's an honor to be here along with the other panelists. It might be helpful if I start with just a short bit of context on the Best Performing Cities Index, how it relates to the Milken Institute, and where we have gone this year. So for the better part of about 2 decades, the Milken Institute has produced what we call the Best Performing Cities Index, which essentially tries to get to the question of where are jobs being created in the United States and where are quality jobs being created in the United States. To do that, we look at a series of 12 indicators relating to job and wage growth, and then additionally look at high-tech growth and high-tech industries within local economies. Now, those first job and wage indicators really form the core of our index and have historically formed the core. And the second half of those indicators related to high-tech job growth and high-tech industries really get to the question of job quality, because at the Milken Institute, we believe those high-tech jobs are more likely to provide a high quality of life and higher incomes for their populations. This year, we have added 3 new indicators, which are related to housing affordability and measures of broadband access. To a large part, we believe that those indicators give a measure of the infrastructural foundations that allow cities to prosper economically. So for instance, looking at broadband access, a city can't really grow a high-tech economy without having really strong broadband access for said industries. So that's kind of a brief synopsis of how the Best Performing Cities Index works. This year, there were a number of storylines. Of course, the one everyone has been thinking about is the coronavirus pandemic. And really, the Best Performing Cities Index offers a sort of first look at how the pandemic has affected metro economies within the United States. One of our measures within the index is a measure of short-term job growth, which is the last year. So for this year's index, we measured October 2019 to October 2020, which captures about 6 months or so worth of pandemic economic effects. And what we found is that what we typically think of as superstar cities, those large cities in the United States, think Los Angeles or New York City, took the brunt of pandemic-related job losses. Part of the reason for this is that these kinds of job markets, while they do have a lot of high-tech jobs and high-tech industries, also have a large part of their economies dedicated to service sector work. And as we know, service sector work, including food and hospitality and accommodation, took a significant hit because those industries were not able to be performed in person when many of the economies shut down. So that was really one of the first takeaways, is that these large superstar cities took a big hit related to the pandemic. The other trend that was very interesting for us was a shifting role of a shifting geography, of innovation within the United States. Typically, we think of innovation happening along the coasts. The first city that comes to people's mind is San Francisco. You might also think of Boston or Cambridge, and that's typically where innovation has been concentrated within the United States. This year, our tier 1 cities, the best performing cities, were mostly located in the Intermountain West in states like Idaho, Colorado, notably Utah, and also across the Sun Belt, some of the Space Coast in Florida, as well as places, in Alabama, for instance. Sorry, I'm blanking on the name. Huntsville, Alabama, also known as Rocket City. So that has also been a second storyline, is that shifting geography of innovation. Now, to be clear, places on the coast are always going to remain attractive places for industry and for talent, but there are these new innovation centers that are popping up that also have a history of innovation and assets themselves. So taking the example of Huntsville, Alabama, Huntsville is home to the NASA Marshall Space Center. So it has an underlying asset there that it can build an entire economy around, an innovation economy around. So it's not as though the innovation economy is shifting to places where there is nothing, but it's shifting to places where there is already another history in it.
What were some of the insights from this year's report regarding access to opportunity, and in particular, whether there were differences between certain cities seeing more broad-based growth where others were experiencing very concentrated growth, and opportunity tended to accrue to those that had better access, say, to those assets?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something that we tried to get at in this year's index, with a focus on household broadband access and housing affordability. In particular, I think there were two storylines. One is that our first tier cities, those that placed in the top 20% of all cities based on their scores, all had relatively affordable housing costs. One really great example is that across both large and small cities, all 5 metros in Utah performed in our tier, what we call the tier 1 category. Part of that reason is that they have this high-tech innovation and growth, but the complement to that is that they also have relatively affordable housing costs and strong access to broadband. So the people who are moving to, or companies who are moving to Utah, are finding that the cost of living and the cost of doing business there are relatively affordable compared to those coastal metros that we previously discussed. So essentially what we're finding is that the best performing cities actually have more inclusive economies. People are able to live, people are able to access jobs. Firms are finding that there's a lower cost of doing business. So that's one part of the storyline. The other part is that some of these larger metros, or superstar metros, are also being dragged down by those high housing costs. Notably, last year's top performer was San Francisco, which ranked first. This year, it dropped to 24th. Part of the reason was, as I mentioned earlier, that short-term economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic. But another part of that was also the high cost of living within San Francisco, especially the housing affordability. And the same happened with many of the other California metros, notably also Riverside. So we're finding that housing affordability and broadband access are both an underlying infrastructural asset that attracts companies, that allows people to access the local economy, while at the same time really being this attractor and this competitive advantage to grow the local economy.
Excellent. Thank you very much for those insights. Here, I want to turn and bring in Ravi Chaturvedi from the Fletcher School at Tufts, specifically the Institute for Business in the Global Context. Ravi, you've been working on the Digital Planet project, as well as a few others, looking at some similar measures regarding broadband access, regarding innovation, and in particular, the extent to which high-tech activity can drive economic growth. What are some of the insights that you're seeing from the work you're doing at Fletcher?
Thank you, Aaron, and hello to everyone. And I want to agree with Misal's observations from your report. A lot of what we've been doing last year is looking at looking at not just the digital divide in the United States. We called it the uneven state of the uneven digital state of the union, and we also looked at how the pandemic has impacted the rest of the world. So I'm happy to speak to both. A lot of your observations in your report comport really well with what we've been seeing as well. States like Utah, Colorado, and others have benefited in some sense from what I'd like to call really what is really a exodus. It is technology-enabled exodus. It is not. And one question that I guess we need to ask ourselves is, as we move slowly but surely out of this pandemic, how much of this is sustainable? And how much of this, to what extent will there be a reversal to the mean? Because let's not forget that these clusters exist because of centuries of embedded advantages. If you think of the university system in the Boston area, or the entire technology ecosystem built around Stanford and UC Berkeley, or the entire financial ecosystem that's built around New York City. These are centuries of advantages, and so they're not very easy to replace. So time will tell, as to whether some of these changes that we are seeing are temporary, or to what extent are they sticky.
Given the broader focus that you've had through a project like Digital Planet in particular, how would you compare some of the trends we're seeing in the United States? You mentioned the exodus. Here in California, we speak very frequently about the extent to which people have been leaving San Francisco for smaller inland cities in the state, or even leaving for Idaho, Colorado, or Texas. When it comes to cities outside the US, how do these trends fit? Do you see some of the same trends, or are there significant differences in other parts of the world where maybe trends are moving even in the opposite direction, where you tend to have much more dispersed growth? High-tech growth tends to happen outside of cities that have those embedded advantages.
Absolutely. And so, one caveat to start with: yes, the United States, at a country level aggregate, when we compare the United States and its state and pace of digitalization with 89 other economies, as we did in our Digital Intelligence Index, you will notice that at a country level, the United States does obviously extremely well. But as we double click on the country itself, there are significant disparities, and our latest research shows that just closing the infrastructural disparities between urban, and peri-urban areas and rural areas in the United States. The FCC report says it's close to about 80 billion. Our research shows that it is 240 billion, and that's just the United States. Right? Now, if you start looking at the broader differences between what is happening in what we call the global north, there is a technology-enabled exodus happening to some of the other cities where cost of living, as your report indicates, is lower. Broadband infrastructure is abundantly available, and so on and so forth. What you're seeing is, in some sense, an exodus, technology-enabled, in the global north writ large, from on either side of the Atlantic, from larger cities, big clusters, into some of the smaller cities that one would not have thought to relocate to pre-pandemic. The opposite is true in the global south. In the global south, the migration patterns are much more from rural and peri-urban areas into the big cities. So what you're seeing is a concentration of urbanization in the global south, whereas in some sense, a bit of a deconcentration, with the caveat that we don't know how sticky it is in the global north. So there is a variation in the patterns.
So building on that point, I want to bring in Jana Nelson here, who's the Latin America lead for the Amazon Web Services Institute. Jana, given your experience in Latin America, how do you see these trends playing out? And in particular, I was wondering if you could speak to the cases of, say, Brazil and Mexico, the largest countries in the region, home to Sao Paulo and Mexico City, the largest cities in the region. Do these trends play out in the same way, say, in both Mexico and Brazil, or do you see important distinctions between countries in the region?
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. And as mentioned, the Amazon Web Services Institute is the Amazon Web Services think tank for technology and public policy. And we're looking at trends, emerging trends in the digital world and the digital economy. It's been really interesting hearing Michelle and Ravi talk about their research and what they've seen. And from my perspective, it's much more, it's less of data analysis, much more seeing what's happening in terms of hearsay, seeing the movement of peoples with whom I work in the region. And although I can see how the migration trends in the global south would be from rural to urban areas, there's a variation in what consists an urban area, right? And what I've seen, at least in the higher income levels, is folks have been using technology to choose quality of life during the pandemic. And as Ravi says, we'll see how sticky that is. But folks have moved from Sao Paulo, from Mexico City, to middle-sized cities, 2 to 3 million people, right? So not small, definitely urban areas, but much more livable. And these cities, similar to what you've seen in your report, in the Milken Institute report, these cities tend to be ones with good universities, have a budding tech hub. And so that's an interesting dynamic. Let's see how long it goes for. What we've also seen is a challenge with human capital, right? Human capital, or in terms of what the economists this week terms the growing divide between the less and the more educated. If you're going to use technology to improve your quality of life, you have to become educated in jobs for this industry. And we have seen a dearth of folks that have the background to be a solutions architect for cloud, for example. We're working on it, as are many other companies, but that is a challenge that was before the pandemic. It happened during the pandemic, and it will continue in the future. So that is definitely a trend. And more a little bit out there, but still very interesting. The legal adaptations that are happening in Mexico recently is discussing a law right now on companies and telework, what companies have to do to adapt to teleworking. But overall, the pandemic and teleworking has improved the quality of life, in particular for those that have the ability to use technology in their work, not so much for those in the informal sector.
That's an excellent insight. And here I actually do want to dig in maybe just a little bit deeper and ask, when it comes to those questions we were discussing with Misael about equality of access to opportunity, certainly Brazil and Mexico have had numerous challenges in that regard. Latin America as a region has been known for some time for having particularly high Gini coefficients. Inequality has long been an issue. When you look at a country like Brazil, for example, or Mexico for that matter, could you speak to the extent to which technology is either further reinforcing some of these inequalities or helping people overcome them? And in the case of somewhere like Brazil, I'm particularly curious about what that means for this geography of access to opportunity. Do you see the same kinds of, say, tech-led development starting to take root in the North or the Northeast, which have traditionally been at a lower level of development and quality of life? And is the growth still concentrated in cities like Sao Paulo or Rio? Or do you actually see some of that geography starting to shift?
No, the geography is definitely starting to shift towards middle-sized cities. You see both in Mexico and in Brazil, not just during the pandemic, but even a little bit before, and I suspect it'll continue, folks moving to cities like Curitiba in Brazil, or in the case of Mexico, to Mérida, that are just nicer cities to live in for different reasons. They're walkable, more leisure areas. And technology, there's an interesting question about inequality, but I think what's most important, I'd like to see how this is going to change in the future. Technology has really helped people become more productive. And by that, I don't necessarily mean work more. I mean that instead of spending 2 hours in the commute that folks would do or normally would do in Mexico and Sao Paulo, they now are able to work from home, right? And they're able to work from home, yes, because of technology, but because of the shift in culture that wasn't there before, that mandated them to do the commute. So I think the tackling of inequality through increased productivity and ability to do multiple different jobs, if you will, with a little bit with Well, I think that that's an interesting question, seeing how that is going to change in the future, how sticky that will be. But definitely to answer your question, there is a shift towards middle-sized cities. Again, these middle-sized cities are not the cities of the United States. They're still 2 to 3 million people cities. They're fairly large, but they're more livable. And technology has, through a number of different ways, improved the quality of life of workers in Latin America.
Thank you. Here, I'd like to bring in the final one of our panelists, Neelan Sirkar, who is a visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, also a scholar at Ashoka University. Neelan, could you speak to how you see some of these trends playing out in South Asia and in India in particular? Do you see, as Jana was discussing, some of that movement from the mega cities of the region or of India to maybe more mid-sized cities? Or is growth still very concentrated in the cities that have traditionally, or at least over the last few decades, been the hubs for high-tech development?
So first, let me apologize. I was a bit late coming onto this webinar. Speaking to the issue of this panel, Indian connectivity can be tricky at times, and I've fallen prey to it. I'm actually in a tea garden. I'm in Darjeeling, but we're having storms, so that's unfortunately wreaking havoc with connectivity. But I'm hopeful that you can all hear me and we're able to sort of get through this. So, when it comes to the question of whether growth is concentrated in the megacities, or are we seeing some growth in the periphery? So India has an interesting pattern of urbanization. Some people call it subaltern urbanization. And the idea is that actually a very high percentage of urbanization that we categorize in India are rural areas turning urban. Now, this may not bring cities. It means that people are essentially moving out of agriculture. People who are living great distances from large cities, who may have a smartphone or a laptop and be able to hotspot off a smartphone to be able to work. I think during the pandemic, we did actually see this sort of manifesting itself. So what you might normally see in Delhi, right, where I live and work, is that people coming from all over India who have a certain level of human capital working in an office together. Lockdown happens, everyone has to go back. And if you've been following India recently, you know that another lockdown is very much in the offing. The cases are spiking here. So people have learned how to work essentially from their small towns and build an integrated whole. Is this going to be at the scale of what we're seeing in Mexico and Brazil? Absolutely not. I don't know that connectivity is as strong within South Asia, and certainly levels of human capital are not. But it does say that for a certain segment of the population, this kind of work is feasible. The other thing I just want to quickly mention, because we're talking, in my context, we're talking about South Asia and India, is that when we talk about connectivity, we're talking about two means tests. So one is functional literacy, right? People, in order to be able to be engaged in an online environment, need to have a certain level of education, which is often missing even from professional environments for a certain segment of people working in professional environments, and access to a smartphone or to a laptop, which also has a means test in terms of wealth. So given the wealth distribution in India and given the sort of quality of life that exists in India, this sort of arrangement is still unfortunately only available to a limited few.
Along those lines, I'm curious about the extent to which some of this tech-enabled development is actually producing a longer-term shift in access to those sorts of opportunities. And in particular, I do want to ask about the current Indian government's Smart Cities initiative and the extent to which that has or has not, from a public policy perspective, directly addressed any of these underlying issues. How do you see the government's approach to trying to foster more of access to opportunity, and in particular through access to technology. How is that working out?
So, smart cities is perhaps one of the most controversial programs among those who study urban development in India. It's unclear the extent to which it was renaming of old initiatives, the extent to which proper incentives were given for the kind of development that's needed. I think it's seen as a large umbrella of activities that were awarded to various cities across India. So I think that in and of itself is a little bit harder to comment on. In terms of the technological shift, I want to sort of bring one variable in here, which is, perhaps guided somewhat by the government. You do have telecom players, particularly Geo, coming in and trying to increase connectivity across India. So when we think about the growth of connectivity in small towns, rural India, today you can get a connection in Kashmir, which is sort of when the internet is allowed to run, which was sort of unthinkable for a while. You can get connections in Darjeeling, right? And that is due to government incentives for these telecom providers, for these data providers to come set up fiber cables, to set up connectivity writ large. So in that sense, I would say if we're looking at where the government has created incentives and where the government has generated greater connectivity, it is through these sort of public-private kind of partnerships that we see within India, as opposed to, let's say, some direct government intervention, smart cities type of umbrella program.
Excellent. I do want to remind our audience that we have the Q&A function enabled, so please feel free to drop your questions in there. We'll try to work some in toward the end of the webinar, but we're really looking forward to hearing what you'd like to know more about. Neelam, building on your last point about the role of public policy, and in particular those public-private partnerships or the extent to which this cooperation matters, I do want to direct the same question to Jana when it comes to the public and the private and the particular roles that you see them playing in Latin America. How much variation do you see across countries in the region? Are there certain countries where the public and the private are working more effectively with one another? Are there other countries where it's a little less clear who exactly is the driving force behind this kind of, say, access to high-tech opportunity?
There are efforts on both sides. Governments are in Latin America are digitizing faster over the last year because of the pandemic, as a trend we've seen worldwide. But governments are definitely becoming more digital and also increasingly aware of the need for access for their citizens. And access can be in very different ways. It can be just infrastructure. It can be knowledge about how to work technology for your personal purposes, for your professional purposes. But governments are more and more aware of the need to adapt to a digital economy in their work and in their way of fostering job growth. The private sector works very closely with governments in general. For that, obviously, there are specific projects that a company will take on with a city or with a government. There's also investment happening, high-tech investment happening. There are data centers being built in Latin America by companies such as AWS, but not just. There's several other companies doing some similar work. There's a lot of educational investment happening, training people on how to, in our case, use cloud technologies. But other companies have other focuses, right? Other types of technology they're training for. So I do think it's very much, perhaps not so much in a coordinated fashion, but very much an effort that is happening on the private sector side and on the government side, out of need, out of our reality of today, which is a digital economy. And if you don't adapt, regardless of where you are in the income spectrum, things will not go so well for your country, for yourself. And so people have more and more dedicated resources, individually, companies and government, towards improving their access and ability to work in the tech sector.
Building on the point that you made about the degree to which the public and the private are sort of working on these things at the same time. Um, Ravi, I think some of your work has addressed this question of digital readiness, if you will. What does that mean, and where do you see that fitting in here? I'm curious, because you've looked at the US in your work as well as other countries, are there fundamental differences between what digital readiness might mean in, say, South Asia or Latin America versus the United States?
That's a very good question, Aaron. It's a bit of a challenge trying to trying to measure this across as we do in our case 90 economies. What we did is we created a certain set of, as soon as the world went into a lockdown about March this last year, we looked at which parts of the world were ready in some sense for operating in some socially distant manner during the lockdown, and which ones weren't. And so the definitions that we chose to use, and these are not by any means perfect or comprehensive, but they are at least indicative in some sense that that we can wrap our arms around and put some numbers against them. So what we looked at was a few things. We looked at the robustness of key platforms, technology-mediated remote work platforms, be they e-commerce, digital media, et cetera, that are crucial to continuity of business, right? I mean, can you get your groceries delivered? Can you get your staples delivered home? Are you able to dial up? Sorry, not dial up, but at least connect to the internet and get on Zoom, get stuff done, et cetera, et cetera. So working, being able to work, in a socially distant manner, et cetera, et cetera. We looked at the proliferance of digital payment systems, which we often forget, but just being able to pay digitally and having those payment rails, which we take for granted here on either side of the Atlantic, is not exactly evenly distributed around the world. And then we looked at the resilience of infrastructure, the internet infrastructure to surges. Now, surprisingly enough, when we look back at what we've done, and 12 months ago, the internet is surprisingly held together. It was not built for the pandemic, but surprisingly, it is held together. And when we took all of these aspects together and then we juxtaposed it, and we did this for about 42 countries, what we noticed is that obviously countries like Singapore, the United States, Germany, and others were obviously in better position to function in a socially distant manner, and large parts of the global South, weren't as ready, So large variations still exist, and gaps yet to be closed.
Following on that point, an excellent question just came to us from the audience. How would you advise city leaders with respect to these trends when it comes to, on the one hand, developing an attraction strategy, trying to incentivize more investment, be it in particular industries or even in a very specific geography, versus trying to maybe restructure some of your economic policies to shore up the sectors that are already driving this growth or where you see a lot of things already happening? I want to put this out there to everyone, but perhaps beginning with Neelan, in the context of India, how do you see that balance, say, between trying to incentivize or attract more investment versus building on the assets that you may have?
So I think that, in the context of India, as I said, we're still talking about a precious few who sort of meet the means test to be engaged in these kinds of industries. So insofar as we think about investment in technology and sort of growing these kinds of sectors, I don't know that, and this is just, personal conjecture, I don't know that it makes sense to look beyond existing assets at the moment. Also, given the sort of challenges that exist, sort of economically in India, and certainly the function of the lockdown, and given that this talent is still very, very concentrated in certain sectors, in certain sets of activities. Obviously, in a longer view, you are looking to create, sort of a broader portfolio of technology within India. But I think at this juncture, it's very, very hard for anyone who's sort of investing in this context to look to create new or broader sets of assets than the ones that they sort of see in front of them that can make use of this kind of human capital, but also have access to that kind of human capital.
Jana, how do you see this discussion around assets, either trying to build new ones or attract new sources of investment versus perhaps focusing on what you know you do well or using the tools that you have in your toolkit?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. I think it's on the mind of most policymakers, right? The world is changing. How do I get on the boat? I would say a very strict focus on how do you improve your citizen services as you adapt to a digital economy, as governments become more digital. And by that, of course, there's digitizing of documents, but there's so much more. How do you provide cloud native services to your citizens? How do you allow them to do everything that they need to do, interacting with government from their home, from their computer, without having to spend hours on a line trying to get in touch with the bureaucrat? If you focus on that, if you focus on improving your government services, doing a digital transformation of your city, of your state, of your country, of your ministry, all of that will naturally lead towards more investment, more increased productivity, increase an improved economy. I think it's less about pursuing the investment of the tech sector and more about creating an environment in which it's tech friendly and tech native.
That's actually an excellent bridge to another audience question I do want to bring up here about civic leaders' commitment to improving infrastructure, mitigating serious traffic problems. Jana, you mentioned some of the commutes that individuals face in Latin American megacities. Even things like the public transportation system and the actual architecture of these cities. Misael, when it comes to these discussions in a US context, you were talking a bit about the inclusion of housing affordability, broadband access. Are there other indicators that might be relevant here when it comes to creating an environment that is amenable for people to live, for businesses to create jobs? Or is it really about the sort of standard assets that we've looked at when it comes to human capital? Say, you mentioned universities and existing high-tech industries. How much does it matter that in the US context, you address some of these structural questions?
I think it matters a lot. I think we have to think of cities and economies as ecosystems, and each of these plays a role that is not insignificant. In terms of the question of what I would add in addition to broadband and housing, really related to both of those is the question of transportation and the question of access. Not only is that important for the worker, i.e., can I get to a job in a reasonable amount of time, it's also relevant for firms, right? Because if there's a strong public transportation network, that also means you can attract workers from further away, expanding your talent pool and your workforce. That transportation is also such a critical element. What Jana was mentioning about Mexico City, it's not uncommon for someone in Mexico City to commute 3 hours each way. And the quality of life that they experience is so low when you're commuting 3 hours each way. For myself, I've also done some research on Mexico City during my graduate time. And what's really interesting is that the geography of opportunity is really concentrated in what has historically been thought of as the center of Mexico City, and westward of that, which is where the financial district now is. And really the question of whether or not you're able to participate in the local economy is the question of, do you have access to the central business district? Do you have access to that new financial center? Otherwise, if you're on the periphery, you're really operating in an informal context and not really, in terms of GDP, contributing as much to the local economy. So really, I think the question for civic leaders is there access to these kinds of opportunities for workers? most notably in terms of transportation for those who don't have, say, what we were speaking about earlier, that means to access broadband or the literacy in order to participate in that. And beyond that, for those that do, maybe for those who live further, is the question of broadband access and housing affordability.
Jana, you were mentioning the extent to which there's been a movement away from those megacities where there are serious challenges when it comes to quality of life, be it transportation, cost of living, any number of issues. Do you see these trends as sticky, or is this a function of what we've been experiencing during the pandemic? And is there a possibility of a reversal starting to take hold in the years to come?
Similar to what Ravi and Michelle have found, I think the trends were happening before the pandemic. They accelerated during the pandemic, and some of it will return. Some people will come back from their homes or summer homes or preferred cities to larger urban areas because they have to or for whatever reason, but many will not. Many will stay in Curitiba, in Ubatuba, in Mérida, in Guadalajara. They're good cities. They have good universities. They have a budding tech hub, and they're livable. They're walkable. So many will stay where they are now.
Ravi, when it comes to the kind of digital development and digital readiness that you've been measuring, could you speak to that question of stickiness or a potential reversal? And when it comes to, say, the next 2 to 5 years, what do you think are some of the more important factors that are going to determine where companies are, say, making their investments or where workers are choosing to locate?
Terrific question. Can I answer it in two parts, one for the global north and one for the global south?
Please.
Great. So first off, Jana made a terrific point a little while ago about citizen services. And we did look at, how citizen services can be, what is the state of citizen services and can they be accessed, remotely during the lockdown again? Large variations again exist. She made a terrific point. Absolutely, that is something that, city, state, federal level, government officials should be absolutely looking at improving those. That is that is absolutely one of the things. Recall how I said there is a exodus that has happened, and we don't know to what extent, especially in the global north, primarily in the United States, how much of it will be sticky. And there's a question, that I saw about what city leaders can do. I think there is a reason why the exodus, to the extent that it has happened, right? I mean, these cities have a decent level of connectivity. These cities are walkable, as Misal and Jana just said. There are a certain set of, reasons why these cities were the destinations for people to move out to. The next question is, what makes them sticky, and how do the big challenge, as I see it, is now we got them, how do we keep them? How do we keep them? So keeping them is going beyond access. You have those facilities, is really looking at how, as one of those old, it's a little old, but I think it's pretty relevant. There is research out there that says for every high-tech job that is created in the economy, the jobs multiplier is about 4.3. Whereas for manufacturing, it's about a third of that, which is roughly around 1.3. So now that you have these tech workers in your city or your state, what do you do to keep them? To keep them is to give them, is to create the barriers, if you will, compelling barriers to exit, which is building out these services. So watch for all these high touch professions, your coffee shop workers, et cetera, moving to your cities, encourage them to move to your cities, chefs, what have you, restaurants, if they move and then make the city vibrant enough for you to stay, that is yet another. Schools, childcare services, all these allied services that you need, to become reasons for whoever's moved to stay on. And make that move a bit sticky. So if I were advising any of the city leaders, who benefited from the exodus, so to speak, I would nudge them towards attracting the high touch workers, or folks that are that are in those high touch professions in living in your city already. So there is where most of the effort needs to be. So the solution is probably less tech, more touch in the global north. In the global south, look, our research is showing, and we looked at access parity, between the global north and the global south as you go from urban centers further away into rural areas. Parity is higher in the global north. It plummets. As you go down to the global south. So plummets to the point that for every 1 unit of access that you have in urbanized areas, it is anywhere between 0.25 to 0.35 in further out. So the challenges are slightly different. I think there is a bigger need in the global south to improve access, whereas in the global north, it is going beyond access. Infrastructure.
You make a fascinating point about the extent to which a lot of this discussion has focused particularly on forms of high-tech development that we're, even in this conversation, conceptualizing as tech and information technology in particular. I would like to expand the conversation a bit to maybe a broader conception of what high-tech development means, and whether there are other industries, particularly in the global south, that may even be sort of in the manufacturing space, but may be, if I can say, high tech enough to drive some of these patterns of growth. I'd like to put this out to whoever would like to answer. I don't have a particular panelist that I want to address, but I am curious about the extent to which maybe this focus on information technology is a bit too narrow, whether we need a sort of broader concept of what high tech development means. And I'm also curious about the extent to which it may be manufacturing activity, it may be other forms of services development. What are the sorts of industries or jobs that we should be looking to next? Is it a matter of focusing on information technology because that's a sector that's been demonstrated to have the capability of, say, working from home? Or is it a matter of maybe shifting gears and thinking a bit more long-term beyond the pandemic about newer environments where people are able to congregate again, be it in production facilities, factories, co-working spaces? It's a bit of an open-ended question, but are we focused a bit too much on high tech as information technology here?
Well, if I may, I think you're absolutely right. For one, the world of technology is very broad, and technology is in a lot of our daily lives, right? It's in the healthcare sector, it's in education, it's in manufacturing, it's in our electricity systems. Everything has there's a touch point in technology, and a lot of what we do and what we consume. And it doesn't have to be the coder behind a computer for several hours a day. It can be, technology is very broad as a term. And the supply chain of technology as well. Data centers need manufactured products as well. So you're absolutely right. It is very broad, which also means there are plenty of jobs to go, right? There's this week, the Economist came out with a special report on jobs. So this is a fortuitous discussion. But one of their conclusions was that the doomsday scenario of robots taking away everybody's job is actually not true. It wasn't before, when it was a doomsday scenario, and now we know for a fact that it isn't true. In fact, as Ravi mentioned, technology generates, if not more, just as many jobs as industries of the past. So it really is a broad sector with many ramifications that is not just sitting behind your computer.
If I can add to what Jana said, so I'll pick one example from the global south, only because I may have said there are more access gaps in the global south, but there are some shining examples out of the global south too. So the city called Coimbatore in the south of India, which and Neelan is a greater expert on India than I am, but which would probably be a tier 2, potentially a tier 3 city. Now that city is an emerging hub for a very different kind of technology-enabled growth, the industrial Internet of Things. So Coimbatore, again, has centuries of advantages of having been close to the textile hub that is, that is in the south, and a manufacturing hub. I mean, fun fact, Coimbatore produces the world's it is the birthplace and potentially the biggest producer of pressure cookers for the world, and nobody knows that. But so there's a tremendous amount of industrial Internet of Things activity, and a lot of technology workers moving to Coimbatore because there is manufacturing. The sort of the Mittelstand of India, located in the south, are very eagerly adopting technology to sustain themselves. So there's a very interesting growth there. So Jana's right. I mean, we don't have to just think of technology and high tech as coders sitting in Silicon Valley. Technology, I guess, is everywhere around us. And the next big growth engines, especially in parts of the world where manufacturing is pretty prevalent, is technology enabling that manufacturing. And so there are definitely opportunities there.
Aaron, if I could turn your question on its head a little bit, I think a missing piece of this conversation is how you turn jobs that are always going to exist into good quality jobs. There's a significant portion of economic work that will always exist. What you can think of as the non-tradable sectors, right? The industries where people will always have to fulfill those in place. And so this is a much broader discussion than I think we have for our panel today. But the question of turning jobs that exist now that might not pay well or that might be dangerous, how do you turn those into livable quality jobs, good jobs for the workers who will continue to do them? That's a really expansive conversation that includes questions related to the minimum wage, to healthcare access and parental care, especially in the United States. But that question does kind of linger in the background of for those workers who are not in tech, for those workers who don't have the access, who don't have the internet connectivity, how do we turn the work that they are into a livable quality jobs? And I think the other question related to creating an economic engine beyond tech is really people. And in the United States, one of the big storylines coming out from the 70s and 80s was the decline of manufacturing. And then now since the 2000s, the rise of technology and innovation in the United States. Part of the reason that we've been able to be so successful as a country is because we've empowered people to innovate, to have access to patents, to allow people to come to this country and innovate and test out their ideas. So really creating a climate in which people can be entrepreneurial, have access to the means of capital, to try out their new ideas, to be connected to ecosystems, and also to create and innovate and create new technologies. So also empowering people for those bright ideas that they might have that are not out yet in the world.
That's a fantastic point. And building on that, I want to ask a two-part question that, again, I'll open to anyone who'd like to pick it up. On the one hand, I'm curious about the matter or the method, I should say, by which we're funding innovation. Essentially, how are we encouraging not just R&D at the frontier of human knowledge, but maybe improvements to production processes, maybe much more sort of slighter product improvements, but that can have significant implications for economic opportunity. Perhaps there's an industry dominated by a particular producer, but with a few additional technological elements, you can essentially create a new product, create a new industry where competition starts to open up again. I'm curious about whether the panelists see any particularly innovative models for, say, funding innovation. And on the flip side, I'm curious about models for taxation, be it, say, taxing remote work. Are countries approaching this question differently when it comes to maybe taking resources that are particularly concentrated and trying to make them more accessible, trying to develop a broader base of growth? Are there innovative models that come to mind?
If I may, I know I've been cutting in and out of it with connections. I hope you can all hear me clearly.
Yes.
So, here's an innovative model, and all of you know, I'm a political scientist, and strangely in India, absolutely on the frontier of innovation vis-a-vis technology.
I'm sorry there. Neelan, you appeared to have cut out for a moment. Do you mind repeating that? I apologize to our audience. It looks like we may be having still some tech issues on Neelan's end. We'll maybe try to get a better connection.
Yeah.
Jana, do you see any particularly innovative approaches to these questions in your work or from your perspective?
Yes.
One of the things
I don't want to
innovating.
I don't want to put words in Neelan's mouth, but what I think he wants to talk about is something that I've seen also in Latin America, is the use of technology is now giving much access to innovation in the global south, right? So before you had fantastic researchers, fantastic universities, but very little capacity to contribute to the research that was being done in the global north, if you will. Mostly because maintenance of computers, data centers was very expensive. You had to train people for that. You needed space. And now we see that access to cloud technologies has allowed
using your technology. Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you hear me
to really access to really tap into research that's being done in other countries, right? To really bring all that knowledge that we had in the global south to the global north. So you don't necessarily, I mean, yes, innovation and investment in innovation is important, but decreasing the cost of innovation is just as important. And that's what we see today. It's the decrease in access to these massive computing technologies that these universities in the global south now can tap into and thus contribute their knowledge to.
That's an excellent point. And I am kind of curious about to the extent to which there is greater opportunity for, say, cross-border collaboration, be it in research, be it in access to information. Ravi, I'm curious whether this is something that you're beginning to see, and in particular, when it comes to some of those questions of digital readiness, are there any examples that come to mind of say, a particular city or a particular country for that matter, developing enough of that infrastructure that they have gained greater access to information, greater access to, say, opportunities to collaborate or to build on research or trends that are coming from elsewhere?
Absolutely. One example that comes to mind is Estonia's e-residency, right? I mean, you could technically be a digital resident, and you don't have to ever physically set foot in Estonia. You could connect, collaborate, and create, companies work, in Estonia for operate in the EU and beyond in the entire world. And it is a terrific program. What they've been able to do in more ways than one is add, and I think if my numbers are right, in excess of about a few $100 million euros, to their public purse by taxing digital economy activity that is happening by these e-residents. And without a, and all of this is, think of this as digital immigration without ever physically having anybody, walk into the country. And it's a tiny country. So, it's a fascinating model. I personally, I'm a huge fan of, what they're trying to do. It's still an experiment, but I do see an opportunity there for, for them to, for other countries to take that, and small countries especially, to take that and then replicate it.
Excellent. Well, with that, I think we've got just about less than a minute to wrap up here. So I want to go ahead and thank all of our panelists, Neelan, Jana, Ravi and Misael, thank you very much for your contributions to this critically important conversation. I think we are going to come away from today's conversation with some great insights and, more importantly, some good questions to keep asking about how these trends are playing out during and beyond the pandemic. Hopefully, we will be moving soon to beyond the pandemic. But thank you all for joining us. I think today's discussion has been particularly illuminating. And please join us here at the Milken Institute and our partners at Global Wonks for more of these great conversations going forward. I hope everyone has an excellent day, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you.